We are currently on the day one cope cycle of Nintendo v Palworld, the lawsuit that was just filed. As a bit of a recap, for the past 7 months, all anybody could do was just bleat on about how Nintendo would never sue Palworld, how they didn't have a case, how they would totally lose epically, and how they weren't even going to try, and how Palworld was the greatest thing ever, and how it didn't plagiarize Pokemon at all, but it's better than Pokemon in every single way, shape, and form. Yeah, Nintendo filed that lawsuit on September 18th, 2024. And now, for the past day, people have been coping and seething. Individuals like Felicify, Mudahar, Asmongold, Sean Maelstrom, Grums, who I have publicly disavowed now for being such a fucking cocksucker, right? All of these people will come out unilaterally and try to say that Nintendo is abusing the court system, that they don't have a case, that Nintendo doesn't have a leg to stand on, which is quite interesting considering they have filed the lawsuit. They are very confident in what is about to happen. And all anybody can do is just kind of deny, deny, deny. And we're in this really weird situation now where, first of all, people are denying what they said like months and months ago, right? In regards to how Nintendo would never, never, ever, ever sue Pocket Pair, how they couldn't do anything, right? They're denying they ever said that. And now they're trying to make up some weird fan fiction narrative about the current state of things, right? Like, Nintendo specifically said that they are going after Pocket Pair for patent violations, right? And over the past day, we have seen YouTubers and shills, Twitter users, the same kind of people who think Legal Eagle and Nick Rekieta offer like biting legal commentary in spite of the fact that neither of them practice, right? We're seeing the internet create this weird fan fiction theory that the patents are superfluous, right? That they are covering a wide range of generic topics that have been in games for decades. That is the cope right now. Considering the fact that Nintendo hasn't specified what patents have been violated and what they're going after Palworld for, this entire thing is bunk like from the get-go, right? Like you are not going to convince anyone that Nintendo's lawsuit against Palworld is frivolous, right? Anyone who's been invested in this from day one understands that Palworld plagiarized a number of critical aspects of Pokemon's game design, right? I was not surprised at all to see that Nintendo filed for patent violations because this goes beyond Powell's plagiarism goes beyond the simple designs. I know we hyperfixate on the designs of the pals and how they're deliberately designed like ripped off from various Pokemon games, right? But that isn't the core. That isn't like the only issue, right? A lot of the mechanics are ripped off from Nintendo games, right? They are ripped off from Pokemon Legends Arceus specifically, and everyone's trying to create this narrative that Nintendo doesn't own those those mechanics or those features, right? But it simply isn't true, right? You can't just copy and paste the way things work in one game and then utilize it in another, right? And I do think that is what Nintendo is going to demonstrate in this lawsuit. How Palworld plagiarized their software, their code, their property, and sold it illicitly under their branding. This is going to be an epic L for Pocket Pair. There essentially is no win condition for this because they won't be able to afford a lengthy lawsuit. They have no legal ground to stand on. Like essentially all they have right now is a bunch of like delusional out of touch fanboys in the West who think they can comment on Japanese law. Like they seriously think like they seriously think like it's a patent violation, not a copyright one, is like some epic W for like their team, right? They really think that Nintendo is is going to lose this. They really think Nintendo is some evil corporation for daring to protect their property. And I do think this is the thing that really needs to be called out because I'm seeing a lot of people on supposed anti-woke communities, people like Raging Golden Eagle, people like Itaku in Action, especially that retard Grums, right? Mark Kern, right, the Firewatch guy, the guy who's so irrelevant, all he does is tweet about like woke stuff in games. All of these guys who are supposedly hyper fixated on woke culture in games, who supposedly really hate wokeness in video games, who are very anti DEI, they're coming out religiously trying to condemn Nintendo for doing something that they absolutely are in full legal right to do. Protecting their IP, protecting their intellectual property, right? Nothing Nintendo has done is wrong in this situation. But all of these people desperately want to pretend otherwise to the point where they're making like insane leaps. I talked last night about how Raging Golden Eagle tried convincing his audience that like Pokemon ripped off Dragon Quest, which is ridiculous, right? I've talked about that argument at length over the past several months. It's like the most brain dead take imaginable, right? But Grums is pushing the narrative that like Nintendo is scared of Palworld. That's another aspect of this is that like people seem to think that Nintendo was intimidated by Palworld's success of just copy and pasting their game design and releasing it on PC, right? Like, that's the big narrative right now is that like people seriously believe that Palworld is a serious a viable Pokemon contender when in reality it isn't, right? We've all seen what happens to Pokemon competitors, right? Digimon, Yokai Watch, like Temtem, right? They get propped up by people who like want to try and ruin Pokemon, and then they just fall off the wayside because they just aren't as good as Pokemon. And that's kind of what's happening with Palworld now, right? It was propped up because people thought they could use it to be an anti-Nintendo thing, but now it's all falling apart like quite a bit quicker than most games that are propped up, right? To this day people still won't admit that The Witcher or From Slop has fallen off, but like Palworld fell off in like a mere 8 months, right? Like actually 2 weeks, but like considering the player count thing, like Palworld really had no momentum behind it at all. But, that's not what the internet will have you believe, right? Like to them, it's some giant, like giga, like new IP. But the reality is that like it was only big among the online gaming community, which, as I've explained over and over and over again, is a very niche thing that does not represent the actual market at all. The actual market demonstrates that Pokemon is a far superior franchise, right? Pokemon that has like a generation cycle, a new release every 3 years, Pokemon that has spin-off games, anime, merchandise, right? Like a successful card game, right? The second biggest in the world, right? Palworld was never, ever, ever going to compete with that, especially by being like such a bootleg knockoff product, right? It just wasn't going to work long term, right? Aside from that initial like shock value, like, oh, I get to use my Pokemon as slaves. Like, what about Palworld is so interesting? What makes it so special? Right? The only reason this is talked about and the only reason people care is that it's something that people can use against Nintendo and the Pokemon Company. Once it stops serving that purpose, you're going to see people stop talking about it, not care, and move on to the next big anti-Nintendo thing. Right? I've explained this over and over again over the past several months, but like again, when the only time people ever talk about Palworld is whenever Nintendo is talking about a lawsuit, right? They talked about their initial concerns early on, like in February and March or whatever it was, and now they formally filed their lawsuit now, after Palworld fell off of relevancy. I can tell you, day one, in spite of what the internet is trying to do, right? With them trying to like say like what Nintendo is doing is worse than like the woke community is doing, right? In spite of their like fear mongering, in spite of like their narrative, it's really not taking off in the mainstream at all. Like they have a handful of like obsessed like dipshits who hate Pokemon and want to see it fail, but that's maybe a couple of 100,000 people, which is like nothing in the grand scheme of things. Generally speaking, most people don't know Palworld even exists or cares about it at all, or even know the lawsuit is happening, right? Like there isn't going to be some major big controversy in regards to this because the vast majority of the people who saw Palworld looked at that thing and were just like, Nintendo is going to take that down, right? Outside of the group of people who delusionally try to convince themselves that it was somehow legal and it was somehow fair use, right? Like outside of that very niche demographic of people who delusionally push that claim, like most everybody knew that this project was going to be taken down. They were going to get sued. And no, like the idea that people had that like, oh, Nintendo could have taken it down right away, like for whatever reason, probably to to maximize their earnings when they came to collect. Nintendo did not file their lawsuit right away. They didn't have to, right? Because they have such an upper they are so overwhelmingly in the right that Pocket Pair really absolutely has no chance at this. Like regardless of what everyone else tries to say. And I do think that's the major takeaway from this is that like the people who are pro Power World, everyone I've seen, Clownfish TV, like they're all major grifters who know nothing about the Pokemon IP, know nothing about Nintendo, know nothing about like Japanese law or copyrights versus trademarks or the Pokemon IP, like what Power World did, right? They're just essentially pandering to YouTube analytics by trying to they're playing the YouTube algorithm is the way I would say it. They are playing the YouTube algorithm to by telling people that Nintendo is doing something bad and terrible. They're going after small indie developers. But the reality is quite different, right? Much like how people like Review Tech USA try to enable people like Gary Bowser or how Mutahar tried to say that Yuzu was completely legal. Like the reality is these people have no real influence in the real world, right? Like what these people say and do and what they believe about Nintendo and their practices doesn't mean a whole lot, right? Like I've said this over and over and over again. In the real world, there is a very good reason why Nintendo has to protect their patented material, right? There is a very good reason they have lawyers. There is a really good reason they go after emulation and piracy and derivative products like Palworld, right? Like again, I have always been pro Nintendo in this regard, and that is not going to change as they proceed through this lawsuit and they begin to dismantle this lie that Power World has constructed.